Erev Tov, everyone. We're so happy to have you joining us tonight. We're going to give it about 1 minute for everyone to gather. And one of the practices I learned from Roz's book is that when you are forming a group and people are gathering, that rather than try to fill the space with lots of talking and greeting, we can sort of hold a sacred space, sit for a moment, and allow the gathering to be. So we're going to do that for just 1 moment. Just allow ourselves to gather. Well, it happens to be that our Parsha this week is all about building sacred spaces. And sacred spaces are about not only the physical building that we build, but also our rabbis teach us about the sacred space that we build inside of ourselves and with our communities. And that's why it is such a pleasure and a joy and a privilege to have my friend, Weiner, here tonight to be able to share the sacred work that she has engaged in of building sacred spaces, places that really allow and enable people to get in touch with the deepest parts of themselves and with a connection to God. And so, Roz, I want to invite you to share with us as we begin a sense of like who are you, Roz? What is your work all about, and how did you find your way to spiritual direction?
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you all for coming and giving me the privilege and the pleasure of talking about my work. When I went to graduate school, which was more than 50 years ago, it was a rule that you left all things to do with religion and spirit outside of the treatment room. And in fact, if you brought up something about it to one of your supervisors, you were very seriously chastised. The general statement was, when are you going to outgrow your reliance on these patriarchal customs? And some of my supervisors were actually Jewish. And this never sat well with me, but I wanted to finish graduate school. So I kept my questions to myself, got the learning that I could, and it was good learning. I'm grateful to my university. But I've always had these questions because I've always wondered about when, and I mean, since even teenage years, I always had a connection to God. I talked to God. And at times, I think somewhere deep in my soul, God talked to me. But I also knew, because I read a lot, that sometimes religion caused conflict, obviously, not just the wars of religion, but conflicts in families and conflicts in marriages, you know, if somebody was going to get married or not to somebody who wasn't the same religion, and so on. And I had no idea, with a PhD and a postdoc, an internship and a postdoc, how to talk about religion and spirituality in a therapy room in a non-judgmental, non-directive way, where religion and spirituality could be examined as a source of conflict or a source of healing, or both, depending on the circumstance. And I struggled with that because I won't do something that I don't know how to do, even if it's something I want to do. That's, you asked about me, that's me. But I really wanted to know it. And for a long time, I couldn't know anything about it because there wasn't a way to learn it. But in 1998, so that was already 30 years in, the Mass General Hospital, in their infinite wisdom, opened a unit of clinical pastoral education, which is how chaplains get trained, to healthcare providers. And I was there before the ink was dried on the announcement. And I signed up, and I was the first psychologist that got trained in this program in Boston. And so I did a complete unit of CPE. I won't walk you through that, but it taught me several very important things. One is that there is a difference between caring and caretaking. And I was already sufficiently old that you think I would have known that. But I credit CPE with allowing me to maintain a clinical practice until just last year. Because I learned the trap of fixing. But I came out of there knowing some things about how to talk about these matters, but not enough. And so I went to BU to get a degree in theology because my intellect needed feeding. I'm a researcher's daughter, and I'm also, that's my father. And then my mother believed a lot in experience. So I got the experience from CPE, but I didn't have enough intellectual grounding. And when I was at BU getting this master's degree in theology, it was in the section of the School of Theology, which is practical theology, because that's what I care about. How do you apply theological principles and practices to everyday life? And one of my professors introduced me to this practice called spiritual direction. We'll talk more about what spiritual direction is in a minute. And I found it fascinating. And coincidentally, or perhaps there are no coincidences, at that very same time, the very first training program in spiritual direction taught by Jewish people for Jewish people was being offered. And so I signed up. I continued my clinical practice. I wrote my 4th thesis. I like being a student. And I took the training. But then the question was, what was I going to do with it? And that leads us now to spiritual direction.
All right. So before I get to, I think, the most important question of the introduction, which is what is spiritual direction, and particularly what is group spiritual direction, I want to pick up on something that you just said. You talked about the trap of fixing. What is the trap of fixing?
When you sit with another person and they tell you about whatever it is they tell you about, and you notice something that maybe is hurting them or frustrating them or challenging them, and you have a bone of compassion in your body, and there is no one on this call that doesn't have many bones, because I know many of you, you want to help them. But sometimes that's not the help they need. What they really need is for you to be witnessing what they're going through and accompanying them and giving them space to do their own discernment about whether or not they want to do something about whatever it is we're talking about. We're not talking a clinical situation of biological depression. We're not talking about that. We're talking about perhaps a question about God, perhaps a question about a practice, perhaps a disappointment in life. But sometimes it is not useful to the other person because the fix you would offer is the fix you think you might like if this was happening to you.
And did you find yourself as a fixer often in the clinical practice?
Absolutely, because there, it's in some ways even more complicated because you do have to fix certain things. If someone is talking to you about wanting to end their life, you have to do something about that. If someone is being abused, you have to do something about that. So it's always a both and in clinical practice. But I learned the and. I learned that sometimes a little more silence and a little more quiet and just a delicate question or two frees up something in the person. And they begin to formulate their own solutions. Then the therapist, I'm back in that hat for a minute, can step in and help and advise and help to shape. But I'm talking also, and more importantly, about friendships. Us on this Temple Manual call tonight. It's a human quality to want to help somebody who's hurting for whatever reason they're hurting. But the question is, are there other ways of helping? And I'm identifying being with is one of the most important ones.
So talk to us about what is spiritual direction and how does it help hold that container?
So I'm going to share my favorite quote first. I told it to you the other day. It's by someone I don't know, but I've been using this quote for probably 20 years now. I know he's a philosopher and I know he cares about theological matters, and his name is Douglas Steer. And this really captures why I do what I do as a prelude to talking about what spiritual direction is. To listen another's soul into a condition of disclosure and discovery may be amongst almost the greatest service that any human being ever performs for another. And that's what I get to do, and which is why I feel so blessed to have this calling. Spiritual direction is an opportunity, an invitation to notice the sacred elements of our everyday life. It's very practical. We notice the physical elements. We notice what comes up in our minds. We know what comes up in our feelings. But we all have something that I would call a soul. Somebody else might not want to use that word. But in this setting, I think it's a good word to use. We all have that deeper part of ourselves. And I think of the soul sometimes as a muscle, like any other muscle. And if you don't use it, you don't lose it. It's there, but it isn't alive in you. And spiritual direction is this opportunity, sometimes one-on-one. I do that work too. Sometimes in a group, which is my particular passion, to do that probing of self, to exercise that muscle and be witnessed in doing it.
Talk to us for a moment about the concept of spiritual direction as an idea and as a sort of therapeutic group modality, in the sense that, spiritual direction kind of implies that there's a direction, right? We're going somewhere, or that we are being directed. What is the role of the facilitator in directing a spiritual experience? And why would somebody want to participate in something like that?
So the role of the spiritual director is very clear. It's to direct attention. It's to note, it's to pay attention, and in what another person is saying, and in so doing, help them notice or underline what they've already noticed, or invite them to explore. And if it's been a good experience, not all sacred experiences are good experiences, but if it's been a good experience, to invite them to savor it. If it's been a puzzling experience, to invite them to see if they can untangle the puzzle. But it's all on behalf of the seeker. I have no greater joy than to see someone say, oh, that's what I was trying to say. And it's not because I told them what they were trying to say. It's that they spent enough time, sometimes in quiet, sometimes in talking out loud, in making that kind of discovery.
So your book runs us through sort of a template for spiritual direction. We start with this, we then move to a text, we then have reflection, and there are some rules about how a spiritual direction group might function, how a participant might function. What's the most important piece of that for you?
Helping people be comfortable in quiet. And helping them not be afraid to be vulnerable in sharing spiritual doubt, spiritual yearning, spiritual longing, even just to put the language on it. Someone recently, not in a group, but just a person that I know, don't know her well, but apparently she read the invitation to tonight and said, basically, she said, you're kind of an interesting person to me. But in a much more, I may be embarrassed to say how she said it. Okay. So she said, but I'm not very spiritual. I want to go on record here in a recorded announcement saying that, in my opinion, everybody is spiritual, but we don't always feel called to, we don't always take the time to, we don't always have the tools to investigate it. Who teaches it to us, or where's the opportunity to do a deep dive into one's own spirit? You asked before something about the difference between individual spiritual direction and group spiritual direction. Let me just explain that. In individual spiritual direction, a person comes to another person and says whatever it is they feel like saying. I mean, they could talk about an adventure they had at the grocery store. I should only be allowed someday to go back to a grocery store. But the point is, they can talk about whatever they want, and it's my responsibility and joy to help them focus their attention on whether there was any spiritual element to what they experienced. And usually after a time, not the first session necessarily, but after a time, the seeker, the directee, begins to notice themselves. And they come in, this is what happened. I thought it was just a this, but it turned out to be a that. And I want to look at it more deeply. That's an individual work. In group work, in the way that I do it, and I guess what I should be clear in saying that the book represents my approach to group spiritual direction. There are now other people beginning to do it in this way, but when I devised this practice and wrote this book, it had usually been done in a different way, a lovely way. It just didn't work for me, and we might get into that at another time in another part of our conversation. But in this group work, I provide a structure. Now, what happens within the structure, you alluded to it, there's several parts to it. It's like a container. And the container, though, holds whatever it is people want to put into it. So it's not directed to a goal other than whatever it is that causes a person, and we're all busy people, to set aside an individual, it's 1 hour a month, it's in a group, it's 2 hours a month, whatever causes them, whatever is the leaning, the yearning, the curiosity. A friend told me this was something good to do. Sometimes people call me with that as the reason. That's good, because it meant that something inside of the person was leaning in a direction. It's not my direction, it's their direction. I have my own director.
So let's talk about that. That's lovely. You say you have your own director. You also say that you feel called. You speak about calling, right? You also beautifully somewhere in the book write that you and God are partners, right? This sense, this very real lived sense of God. Can you hold that against this sense that you also lay out in the same time? And you lay it out so beautifully right at the very beginning of your book, when you have a reflection before you've even begun. Literally, it's before the title page. Here, you have a reflection on the ner tamid and this idea of making sure that the light doesn't go out. And you write that God, however God is named, experienced, or understood. And you also ask people very open-endedly, what's your name for God? So how do you balance that very real sense of relationship, calling, vibrancy, realness of God and light with an obligation to hold that light with a sense of this is sort of however you're going to experience or call or feel God? How do you hold that framework open for others?
By first of all, holding it open in myself. What I chose that image for the cover of the book with that explanation, because you learn a lot when you write a book. No, you learn a lot when you sell a book that you've written and you deal with a publisher. And after the book had been edited and it was getting ready, we're getting ready to go, they sent me a cover drawing. And I looked at the cover drawing, and there was nothing wrong with it. I mean, it was a nice cover, but it wasn't me. It meaning it wasn't what I was trying to communicate. And I stared at it for the longest time, and I realized that what wasn't there in the cover was a representation of my understanding both of God and the relationship between God as I understand God and a group and me. And the Ner Tamid represents that as it hangs over the Ark in our shul. Now, it has to leave space for the fact that not everybody that comes to a spiritual direction group is theistic, believes in God, or is sure that there is a God. Some people come who are not that at all, but we all, I think, in order to live life fully, need to have some awareness of what gives our life meaning. I mean, it could be a good meal with friends. It could be a smile on the face of a baby. It could mean surviving an illness. It could mean reading a good book. It it doesn't matter to me what your meaning is. If you want to seek a deeper understanding of it, I'm there for you.
So,
but wait, one more thing.
yeah.
But in core training to be a spiritual director, we are taught from the first minute that the ultimate director, for those of us who seek to be spiritual directors, is God. Now, that doesn't mean that has, and God is always present. That's my Jewish teaching merged with the teaching of spiritual direction, which the Christians did first in the first century of the Common Era, the first 3 centuries of the Common Era. We Jews are Joshua come lately. We're very new at this. But I actually believe if it weren't for the horrors of the Shoah, we would have been there sooner. Because in the visits that people would make to their Rabbis, and I'm not in any way imagining myself as that. I'm a very happy Jew in the pew. But in those conversations, I am persuaded that a lot of things were surfaced about where someone was in matters of faith. And we lost all that. And so we're slower to come to it. Remember I said at the beginning, it's only 20 years in. I did my training 20 years ago. I was in the first cohort of Jewish people trained by Jewish people to do this. And my teachers had been trained in Christian settings.
Right. And I was surprised to read here in your introduction that this is actually the only book that exists about Jewish spiritual group direction. Yes, right? That this has not been done before.
Right. So but it's not, but I will say that it's not limited to it, because it's getting the format that I use is really fairly universal and is working well in both Christian and Jewish settings, because I move in both at this point.
So let's talk about that, right? You lay out, particularly in your chapter, Theirs, Mine, and Ours, that spiritual direction really does have its roots in Christianity. What are some of the joys and pitfalls of translating a spiritual director's language, which is so rooted in that basic Christian understanding of how one has a living relationship with God? How do you translate that language into a Jewish accent?
Well, first of all, it was and I mean this seriously, even though it's going to sound facetious, it was a Jew doing it. So I can only use language that is authentic to me. My greatest concern had to do with appropriation. When meditation first became a hot thing to do, but Buddhism was given almost no credit as its source, it really bothered me. It's very important to me in doing this work to appreciate the people upon whose shoulders I stand, and to acknowledge what I'm borrowing and what I'm leaving behind and why. And the hardest part for me was feeling confident to do that. I do talk in the book a bit about the networking I did among rabbis in the community when I had finished all my training and was first trying to find my way to what was I going to do with it. And that's why I felt there was a call, because all of it came to me like gifts. You know, that MGH opened this program, that my particular favorite professor at BU wanted to spend time teaching me, that the Jewish training program opened up. So all of a sudden I had all of this. I had all the things I'd asked for all those many years of having questions. I had the skills, I had the tools, and I had the heart, but what was I going to do with it? And it's a much longer story, so I'm not going to go into it, but I started doing this networking, meaning I'd cold call, make appointments with rabbis and go in and talk about what I had learned. And the response was not exactly, aren't we glad to know you? And some of them were rabbis that I actually knew before in other things that I do in the Jewish community. There was a lot of fear that somebody once asked me, was I planning to convert? And I explained, no, that wasn't in my plan. But the point is, there was fear of it. Now, around the same time, my son, Ben, who many of you know, was going to I forget if he was going to rabbinical school. Yeah, right around that time, he was going to rabbinical school, or going towards going to rabbinical school. And I started paying attention to how rabbis are shaped in terms of their own personal spiritual journeys. What do they do? Who looks out for them? How are they helped to see that if they aren't taking care of themselves? I mean, therapists have to be in therapy, not all the time and every day, but as part of the training, we're really invited to know ourselves deeply. We're talking 2001, 2002 here, 2003. I started asking questions, what happens to rabbis? And meanwhile, my daughter Miriam was at JTS getting her master's degree in Jewish education there. And so I'd hang out with her sometimes and I'd meet her friends who were rabbinical students, some of them anyway. And they would say, Miriam tells us what you're doing. We don't do that here. And so then I was onto something. And eventually I began to see that part of what I was being invited to do was to pay attention to the spiritual journeys of any rabbi who would wanted to trust me to pay attention. Mm-hmm. Now that then was the second complexity, because like, who was I? I'm not a rabbi. I didn't go to rabbinical school. I have solid Jewish learning, but not the kind of learning that rabbis get. But it just seemed like that's what this was for. Now, the other complexity then was in the translation, because there were ideas that I had about what might work and what might not work. And part of it was, what would I be comfortable offering? And what wouldn't I, as me, be comfortable offering? I got to one of the things that I do, which was to use poetry as an invitation to evoke spiritual experiences. And I got to poetry in the Christian tradition. They would use Bible. They would use something, could be from the Hebrew Bible, could be from the New Testament, it could be from one of the other books that are not our books. When I started thinking about doing that, it occurred to me that if I used something from the week's portion, a rabbi would have a hard time getting past the sermon or the var that he or she planned to do that week. It just didn't seem fair if my invitation was to go back past head into heart to do that. Mm-hmm. And I like poetry. I'm not a poetry specialist, but I like it. It stirs me. So I started using poetry, sometimes Jewish poetry, sometimes secular poetry. And I waited in the first several years of doing this for somebody to say, no, we don't want that. And every once in a while I would tuck in a psalm, or something Jewish, if you will. I often use Jewish poets. And then I actually started asking. And they said, no, this is new. This is different. This is another way of learning ourselves. So I've kept with it. But it took me a while to build confidence.
Yeah, and I was so fascinated by that in your book, because really this idea that comes directly from the Christian practice of spiritual direction is that you should focus around a biblical text, something that you come to draw your attention towards God, and you bring Maya Angelou and Frank Bruni, into your sections for people to meditate on. And you have let go of certain sort of classic spiritual direction benchmarks or things that people are supposed to do, like pray for each other. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about that. Are those things that come from you just because, as you so beautifully put it, that made sense to move past the head into the heart? It was a new way in for people. Or does it have something to do with your sense of what Jewish clergy and Jews in general are open to when it comes to God language? We called this evening Godtalk, right?
Right.
What does it have to do with your sense of what Jews are okay with Godtalk?
Well, I think it's very hard for us to do Godtalk in the sense that I'm talking about it. We learn God, and I think it's a wonderful thing that we do through our study of Torah. God speaks to us through Torah. then the rabbis didn't think that was quite enough. So then they gave us Talmud and all the things that go with it, which is a good thing. I'm not objecting to any of it or criticizing any of it. But it doesn't help us necessarily figure out where we are in our kishkas about what we actually feel. What is our faith? What does that mean? What have we done with the things that have challenged us? Who are we praying to? We're praying to God. What does that mean? What does that feel like? Does that change? And this is an opportunity, the group Spiritual Direction especially, to do a dive into that, witnessed by other people who are doing their own dive at the same time. We learn from each other's experiences. We hold the space to talk about delicate, fragile, nascent glimmerings of something either way beyond ourselves or deep inside of ourselves. That's why I say that I use God as a space holder, because it can change. What I feel, what I felt about God when in the 80s, my own personal life hit a wall and went through some very complex challenges. Rabbi Chil and I spent a long time parsing that one out.
You mentioned Rabbi Chil, right? I want to dwell there for just a moment, because Rabbi Chil was such a big influence for you on your following this path. He was your Rebbe, or your spiritual director in that way. Before we move on, and I have you read a passage that's challenging on this question of Jews' comfort with prayer, can you just dwell on Rabbi Chil and his role in your journey for a moment?
It'd be my pleasure. Rabbi Chil, the rabbi of my youth, but the rabbi of my 20s, 30s, for as long as he was able to be our rabbi. But I want to cite a particular time when he said to me, you have something to say, and you need to get a credential in order for anybody to listen to you. And I for a time, once women were able to be ordained, he nudged me in the direction of JTS, and I was finally able to look him in the eye and say, I am not meant to be a rabbi. That's not my calling. I'm a very happy psychologist, but yes, I do have something to say. So he encouraged me when CPE, clinical pastoral education, was available. He encouraged me to do that. He chose BU for me. There were 3 choices of possibility. One was, well, it doesn't matter which the other ones were, but he said, you go to BU, they have this practical approach, one of their sections. It will be good and you will have a credential, and then you can use what you have. I'll always be grateful to him for that. And he wrote my letter of recommendation.
Our beloved Rabbi Chil, he directed so many of our paths as we walk in life. So I'm going to ask you to pick up on page 121 with a passage from your book that I found at least particularly challenging and speaks to some of our discomfort, even within this sacred container that you create with prayer, with God language, with connection. So if you'll read for us one additional note.
One additional note regarding personal prayer. In preparing for the final gathering of our 2018-2019 meeting cycle, I was surprised to notice a stirring in myself regarding personal prayer. It could be God's gentle push, or perhaps the reading I had been doing regarding intercessory prayer. That's prayer on behalf of another. But regardless of the trigger, there it was. I sat with the stirring for days and then decided to invite us during the liturgy segment of our gathering, which I offered at the end of the meeting, to create a prayer of gratitude for the time we had spent together over the last 10 months. I invited us into silence with the instruction that when ready, each of us, atypically I included me, would share, if we wished, the prayer that had arisen during the quiet. There was no resistance in any of the 5 groups, and beautiful words of appreciation seemed to be effortlessly spilled out among us. However, there has been no subsequent interest in any of the groups to extend this practice.
Okay, so you had this incredible spiritual moment. You talked about God together. You talked to God together, and nobody wants to do it again. Can you unpack that for us?
Well, remember that the stirring came in me. It came from within me. And by then I had the trust of the group. So if I asked them to do something, they would do it. It was the end of the year. We meet 10 times a year. And they were grateful. I mean, they had a particular thing they were grateful about, and they could do it. But after 18 years of doing this work, I would say that it's not yet a Jewish thing to offer spontaneous prayer in non-traumatic circumstance, and especially on behalf of another person. In a traumatic circumstance, of course, we have the Mishaberach, we have Moses's, heal her. But in general, we don't do that. Now, doesn't mean we shouldn't, but we're not used to it. That muscle, the prayer for each other muscle, just hasn't been cultivated.
Yeah. So speaking of that muscle, right? How do you've used the word muscle a lot when we think about spiritual direction and this process here. And you use various other metaphors throughout the book. You talk about swimming, about trees planted and growing. You talk about midwifery. You talk about nourishment, containers, reservoir, mirrors. You use a bunch of different ways to sort of try to put some kind of a container, a metaphor on the process that we can grasp. Is there one that you love, one that's the one that sort of is your go-to, and why?
Well, it's a funny thing about that. It's the same as that I have different words for God. It depends. I mean, it depends where I am in myself at a particular moment, but I got one for tonight, because where I am tonight is having a great chat with you. So my favorite at the moment today, ask me, I have something different tomorrow, is containers. So I'm going to read again. Containers are built to hold things, perhaps to ensure their safety, perhaps so they can be held apart, perhaps so they can be examined closely. We tend to choose a container after we know what we wish to contain. Perhaps in spiritual work, there is another process at play. We are each a container for storing the fruits of our meaning making. Our spiritual containers come in all shapes and sizes, just as we do. We need to pay attention to the well-being of our containers so that they are ready to receive their contents. And perhaps we need to stir or sift or rearrange the containers to be curious about their source.
And what does that mean to you?
It means that sometimes we just don't know what we need. And even more importantly, what we want. And in this case, I would say what our soul wants or our spirit wants, until we have an experience that gives us a little hint of what that might be.
So I want to actually ask you, I'm going to jump on that right now and actually ask you about that experience. You end your book with a reflection about how things have changed in the pandemic, right? You went from that beautiful living room where you had your makom kavua for every person who came in, and your beautiful barrel chair that made you feel so at home, right? To a world of Zoom, which we are in tonight, and things changed in terms of that container that you are holding. How can you give us just a bissel? Can you give us an experience of how we might experience our own sense of openness, questions, how we might sort of find God in this moment right now on Zoom together.
Sure. I just happen to have a poem. No, that's because I really, where did I put it? Because I did a group 2 hours ago. So I have it, but I have to find where I just put it. Hold on one second. I'm surrounded by pieces of paper. Okay. So what you would do if you were in a group with me right now and somehow you knew each other and we had some trust. I know enough of you that trust me, please. I would say to you that I'm going to read you a poem. I'm going to read it twice. The first time, just hear it. The second time, notice that if you have the poem in front of you, certain words would be bolded. Those are your words tonight. If we were in a group of 4 or 5 people, I would ask you when I finished reading it twice to say your words aloud. This time, just hold them for yourself. Then, after I've done that, I'll give you the next instruction. So
Roz, can we ask people to put their word in the chat?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
If a word comes to you that you want to share, put it in the chat.
Now, this is a word from the poem itself. It could be a phrase, whatever is good. And I will read slowly. The poet is a poet you've never heard of. I never did either. But Rabbi Google and I have regular visits. And when I was looking for a poem on vulnerability, because I'm feeling very vulnerable these days. I'm immunocompromised. I've been in this house forever. I go out a little. So I've been on Zoom even more right now. I put all my groups back on Zoom. We were together a little bit a couple months ago. So this poet is Drew Myron, and she lives in Oregon. Vulnerability. Unless you visit the dark places, you'll never feel the sea pull you in and under, swallowing words before they form. Until you visit places within you, cloistered and constant, you will travel in a tourist daze, wrought with too much of what endures, depletes. If you never turn from light, close your eyes, feel the life inside, you'll leave the temple, the beach, yourself, knowing nothing more. Unless you are silent, you will not know your urgent heart, how it beats between the thin skin of yes and no. Now I'm going to read it again, a little bit slower. See if you can find your words. Vulnerability. Unless you visit the dark places, you'll never feel the sea pull you in and under, swallowing words before they form. Until you visit places within you, cloistered and constant, you will travel in a tourist daze, wrought with too much of what endures, depletes. If you never turn from light, close your eyes, feel the life inside, you'll leave the temple, the beach, yourself, knowing nothing more. Unless you are silent, you will not know your urgent heart, how it beats between the thin skin of yes and no. So if you have words, put them in the chat. And I'm going to go on talking while you're doing that. So the next instruction would be to take your words into quiet. Remember, you're in a room. I know there are a lot of you, but if you're in a group, there'd be 3 or 4 others, maybe 5. And you let your words sink down into you as deep as they'll go and see what comes up in you to meet these words. How is it that this evening, these are your words? Take a few minutes and consider that, and then we'll see what we do next. Now you'd have a lot more time if we didn't have so little time. But what would happen next is something called deep listening. Deep listening means that We've sat 4 or 5 people together. We've each had our words. One by one, people share what comes up. And each of us is listening carefully to the speaker. And lots of coming up inside of us. Our job is to filter out whatever is our curiosity, whatever question we might like to ask the speaker on our own behalf, and see if anything's left, a question that you might like to ask the speaker on behalf of the speaker. And that's what happens. In the first 3-4 months of a group, I'm the only one who's going to ask a question. And that's in some ways as it should be. We're all getting, members of the group are getting their sea legs. But after a while, I don't have to ask very many questions. People do the asking. And here comes the most interesting part. So you said something and you're questioned. You have 3 answers that you can give in response to a question if you're the speaker. The first one is, oh, that makes me think, and you keep on talking. The second one is, that's important, but I'm not sure. I want to think about it some more when I leave here, but thanks for the question. And the third one is, I appreciate your question, but that's not where I was going. How often in life do we get to say from our deepest place, have somebody offer us something and say, no, thank you? Because it wasn't where our spirit was going. We get to hold on to our own spirit, even in a group. And that by itself is practice. Now, I need to insert here that not all of my groups are clergy. Some of my groups are like us. But what's fascinating to me is that some of the clergy groups have been going on for 10 or 14 years. And because people do not have an outlet for this. The rabbis are busy taking care of us. And they don't always know to take care of themselves. And this group does offer that in a self-determined, interactive way.
And fascinatingly, you also shared that you're running some interfaith groups as well. Is there a different character between your rabbis only groups, your interfaith groups, and your just regular human Jews? Yeah.
Well, the interreligious group is new this year. We've met 4 times so far. We have 7 sessions set up for the year. It's sponsored by the Hebrew College's Interreligious Learning Center and the Center for Practical Theology at BU. So it's half and half, all people who will in someday be ordained in their respective traditions. So far, we're using exactly the same structure that I use with everybody else. I did tell Michelle before we started that today we had something unique happen, which is that one of the rabbinical students who will be ordained this year was talking about how Zoom had impacted her prayer practices. And that today she felt called to put on her tefillin. And I watched the faces of the 3 Christian members of the group. And I knew that when she was through, I needed to say, if it's okay, I think you've used a word that is unfamiliar to other people here in the group. Would people like it if so-and-so, and if you would like to so-and-so, show. And everybody nods, and she goes and gets her tefillin, and she spends 2 minutes doing this. And my hope, and part of why I'm doing, one is I wanted to see if my model would work interreligiously. So far, so good. But more important than that, if clergy who will be future leaders in their own traditions learn to be comfortable with each other talking about God, it feels like tikkun olam to me. Mine. That's a bit of chutzpah, but it's how it feels. So far, so good.
Beautiful, Roz. So much of what you're doing is about raising questions and helping people really discover their own still small voice inside of what those questions are. So I want to use this next piece of our conversation to ask for questions from those who are here. Are there people gathered who would like to ask a question? And if so, I'm going to put you all on gallery view. If you'd like to, use the raise hand function if you know how to do that, or you can physically raise your hand if you have a question you'd like to ask, Roz. I see a couple of almost hands.
Can I put myself?
Susan, let you be vulnerable. Thank you for being vulnerable and coming forward and asking our first question, Susan. You just need to unmute.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're good. You're good now.
Oh, okay, I'm good. How can I have you in my life?
What a lovely request. I'll tell you exactly how. We have to just form a group. We need 4 or 5 other people, and you can have me in your life. Or before that, you could buy the book.
And Caitlin, can you post in the chat, how can they buy the book?
Michelle told me I could say that.
Yes, absolutely.
I could plug my book. But I appreciate your saying that, but what are you saying? What are you really saying? I mean,
What am I really saying? I'm saying that I loved what you had to say. I think I could use your wisdom, advice, groups. I don't feel comfortable really saying anymore because I'm a big crier, right, Rabbi?
no problem. No problem. Michelle can tell you how to find me.
I will. I absolutely
I'll
will.
find you. I'm good at that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And anyone else who's interested, please reach out. You can either personally chat me here, or you can send me an email. Janet, if you are in a place where we can see you, we'd love to see your face as you ask your question.
Michelle, can I get to gallery too so I can see the people?
Yeah, you just click in the corner.
Oh, I know how to do it. I thought
view.
you had it not. Okay.
Yeah,
good.
Caitlin has us on focus,
Okay.
but we can see everybody if we want to.
Good.
Okay.
I want to thank you. A very, very beautiful presentation. I've been hearing about spiritual direction, just really didn't know what it was. But, you know, when you said, given the Holocaust, like the experiences that people were having with their Rabbis was probably very much, it, you know, like a rose caught by any other name, would it smell as sweet? We might not have had the term spiritual direction, but certainly that's the purpose of
I agree.
of the
Yes.
Torah. So I guess, or coming up to, you know, building the Mishkan, is it something out there? Is it something in there, in us? And so I guess I would really love for the spiritual direction community, Jewish community, to, you know, to actually say, this is part of us. This is most definitely in our tradition. We might call it something different, whatever, but that's all. And I wonder about that.
We do say it. There's no question that we say it, but we need still to get the word out to people what the practice is and how one can access it. For example, Terry Schwartz Russell said to me that, you know, the interest groups that people are establishing under her guidance, we can have one of those. You know, there's a lot of ways to go about doing this within the congregation if people are interested.
Beautiful. I'll take Marty and then Carol for questions.
Roz, I wanted to thank you for using Tikkun Olam in your last comment before we open it up properly. What I mean by that is that I think that oftentimes we get confused with the term Tikkun Olam. It means save the planet, save the whales. It really doesn't. It's supposed to be you work on yourself first, and then you work on others, because you can't work on others or help anybody else unless you've done the inner work. So thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
A comment rather than a question. So over to you, Carol.
Thank you, Roz. Wonderful, wonderful talk. My question is, how does one decide whether to be in a group versus individual spiritual direction?
Thank you, Carol.
I appreciate that question a lot. I meant to mention that and I didn't. Thank you. I think that, first of all, some people are more comfortable talking about personal things one-on-one, and others like the comfort of many people around them. that they like to listen as much as they want to talk. So sometimes it's a personal style, but if a person had a burning spiritual conflict issue, remember the very beginning, I talked about religion and spirituality be sources of healing and sources of conflict, not the kind that they necessarily needed an immediate repair job done on, which is what I don't do. But they might want to then do one-on-one work. But if a person was more in the, again, using my muscle metaphor, in wanting to develop their spiritual muscle, to be more curious about who God is or the sacred source is for them, then I think group is exciting. And not just exciting, but it's many levels, because you're also really practicing deep listening, listening on behalf of another, which is not an opportunity that you have in individual work. You're mostly listening on behalf of yourself, which is a good and important thing to do. So it's many ways it's personal choice. But sometimes people will call me, and ask, they don't know, and I can usually help a person decide, but often people know what they need.
So, Roz, thanks so much. I thought it was a great presentation. I miss seeing you.
I miss seeing you too. I miss seeing all of you. So I will get freed here eventually.
So 3 anecdotes about Godtalk and then a question. I was thinking about how difficult it is for Jews to talk about God, and 3 things came to mind. One, a number of years ago, when we were doing strategic planning, and we had somebody from the Alban Institute consulting with us who wasn't Jewish, gave a talk, and she spoke about faith, and you could feel the discomfort in the room. And if I'm not mistaken, I think, Michelle, you gave a sermon afterwards saying, hey, it's okay for us to talk about faith. This is a long time ago. Number 2, we were in a group, maybe Michelle, you were leading that also, and a friend who's a Temple Emmanuel person said something like, I go to shul 6 days a week, I'm Shomer Shabbos, I keep kosher, and I never think about God. Number 3, years ago, I gave a devar at Reisman on high holidays, and I sent the talk beforehand to a friend for comments. And the first comment I got was, wow, you're actually speaking about God on the high holidays. So already I like it. So here's a question. You've addressed this a bit. Is there a way for Jews sort of generally to feel that this is okay to talk about God and to talk in these ways that I often hear associated with being non-Jewish, being Southern, being uneducated, and even unsophisticated?
It's a good thing to do, to talk about God, but you need tools, you need practice. You need other people who are willing to do it too. And that's why it's so important to sort out the name you want to give to God. Yeah, it's doable. I've been doing it for people now for almost 20 years. It is doable. And it's not that hard. It's not that hard once you start to do it. It's like anything new that you do that is sensitive. The first time it's awkward, and the second time it's awkward, and the third time it's a tiny bit less awkward. And then pretty soon it's something you look forward to. But it depends what you want to talk. There's a difference between talking about God and talking to God. And then there's probably some other verbs to use too, because each of us in this group, I recognize most of the names, although I don't know all the people. We show up at services and we open the book and we say these words, and they are addressed to something. And I want you to take this on faith, and I use that word carefully. The more you know at a particular moment in time what and who, or about what and who you're addressing, the more meaningful the words become. Spiritual direction is only a path. It isn't the end point of anything, but it is a path that has a lot of benefit.
Thank you, Roz. We're going to take Alice and Leslie as our final questions. So Alice and Leslie.
Hi, Roz, and thank you for tonight. I'm sorry I missed a section of your talk, but I'm wondering if you ever use materials from Kabbalah or Hasidut in your exploration.
I don't use any Kabbalah because, as I said early on, I only talk about or bring things that I feel competent or knowledgeable enough to put forth, to even offer. Now, if somebody in a group said that there's a particular Kabbalistic teaching that they want to talk about because that's what nourishes their soul, that's part of the space that we hold. Anybody can bring anything that animates them, and we'll attend, we'll pay attention to them as they talk about it. In terms of Hasidus, I love Nachman of Bratslav. So he shows up, but Heschel also shows up. And I don't know, there's so many people that show up. My mind is flooded a little bit with all the people that show up, but I don't, it just depends what people need and what they bring and what different groups go different places in terms of material. I create a new curriculum every month. So part of why I wrote the book has almost as many appendices as it has words, is because I know exactly how old I am. I want to do this forever, but forever has a shelf life. And so I'm wanting to put this material out there and interest people in it so that it will go on after I do. So it's all in the appendices, the kinds of materials I've used.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Leslie.
Hi, Roz. Great to see you. Wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Good to see you.
I'm very interested in what you were saying about interfaith groups. And you've been doing that with clergy. And my question has to do with doing that with lay people. And as one example, I started a spiritual growth group a number of years ago after my husband passed away in a church, because I already had very strong connections there. And it was interfaith in the sense that I was Jewish and everybody else was Methodist. And what we did was we shared how we saw the divine. We had a different question each week. It wasn't led. In what you're doing, and you just talked about spiritual direction as a path, and I wonder about walking that path in a multi-faith group that leads us to make stronger connections with people of other religions and tikkun olam through that path. What do you think?
That's my hope. And so, but up to this point, everything I've done without any institutional backing. If I was going to start doing interreligious, I needed institutional backing to make that make sense, because where would the Christians come from, if you will? So that's why I had the idea of going to the Interreligious Center at Hebrew College, that's Rabbi Or Rose, and the Center for Practical Theology at BU, that's Professor Claire Wolfteich. And they helped me find the people. My next goal, if this works and we can continue it with clergy to be, are the various interfaith groups in communities. Most communities have an interfaith ministerial rabbinic group. People get together, clergy get together, and they talk about actions they want to take to prepare society. I understand, for the little bit of research I've done so far, they don't necessarily talk about their own faith, their own, they don't do this necessarily. That's my next, if this works, that's where I'm going next. Because I think it's important.
So Roz, as we're talking about our own faith, you speak in your book about a closing, sort of a sacred close to a session. And I want to invite you to help us close here with a blessing, with with a hope for each of us for our spiritual direction as we move forward from this space.
I hope that for all of us, that we become freer in acknowledging in the words that are right for us at any moment in time, a clear understanding of towards what we are sending our gratitude. And I'm here, ready to first of all, I hope you'll read the book, because it'll tell you a lot more than I could in this short period of time. And there is at least one copy, if not two, in the Temple Library. So I'm not just shilling for the publisher, but I'm doing that a little bit. But at the same time, my blessing is to you that you took the time to be here tonight. And that in the words that Michelle and I have shared together, there was a little bit of something that will stay with you and have meaning for you. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Amen. Roz, we are so deeply grateful to you for sharing both your book and your soul with us tonight. May God bless you in your holy work as you continue to do as our Parsha instructs all of us to do and build a holy sanctuary where God can be found among us and in us. So, Laila Tov Lekulam, thank you for joining tonight. And if you'd like to reach Roz, please feel free to send me an email and I'm happy to make the connection. Thank you again, Roz.
Thank you, Roz.
Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you. A pleasure
Thank
to be
you.
with you. Actually, a joy.